"What are they? What are they?" cried the children, leaving their nuts to the crowd nearer. "I don't know who they are," said Caddie. "There must be a story about them, Mother. Do you know it?" Mrs. Woodlawn looked at her husband. He had taken one of the little shoes in his hand, and it scarcely covered his big palm. He turned it this way and that, smiling an odd, perplexed smile. "Well, well, well," he said, "what a funny little shoe!" The impatient children crowded nearer, and little Minnie clambered onto his knee. "Father," cried Caddie, "you know something about them. Tell us, tell us, tell us," echoed the others. "Yes, Johnny, you had better tell them now," said Mrs. Woodlawn. Mr. Woodlawn still hesitated, his eyes deep with thoughts of something far away, something beyond the warm room and the ring of bright, expectant faces, something less bright and warm and happy. Mrs. Woodlawn stirred impatiently. "Those are your father's shoes, children," she said. "He used to dance in them in England, and the little red breeches, too, long, long ago. Do tell them, Johnny. They've a right to know." "Yes, yes," said Mr. Woodlawn. "They have a right to know, and I have always meant to tell them. But it's a long story, children. You had best go back to your hassocks and your nuts." Eyes round with wonder and anticipation, the young Woodlawns did as they were told. To think of father ever being small enough to wear these breeches and clogs, and dancing in them, too, in far-away England! How strange it was! They had heard so much of Boston, but nobody spoke of England, where the strange little boy, who had grown to be father, had danced in red breeches and clogs. Caddie thought of what father had said about England on the night when the circuit rider had been with them. How often she had wondered about that since then. "You have grown up in a free country, children," began Mr. Woodlawn. "Whatever happens, I want you to think of yourselves as young Americans, and I want you to be proud of that. It is difficult to tell you about England, because there all men are not free to pursue their own lives in their own way. Some men live like princes, while others men must beg for the very crust that keeps them alive. "And your father's father was one of those who lived like princes, children," cried Mrs. Woodlawn proudly. "My father was the second son in a proud old family," said Mr. Woodlawn. He set the clock he was mending beside him on the table, and his hands, unaccustomed to idleness, rested awkwardly on his knees. "My father's father was Lord of England, and the lands he owned rolled over hills and valleys and through woods." "Bigger than ours?" wondered Hetty. "Many times, yes, many, many times. There was a great stone house with towers and turrets, and a moat with swans, and there were peacocks on the lawn." "Peacocks?" cried Clara, clasping her hands. "Yes," said father gravely. "I saw them once when I was a little boy. My mother held me by the hand and stood on tiptoe to look between the bars of the great gate, and there were a dozen of them, stepping daintily with arched necks, and spreading or trailing their great tails upon the grass." "But father," said Caddie, "why were you outside?" "Well, may you ask that question, Caddie?" cried Mrs. Woodlawn. Her earrings trembled with her indignation. "Old Lord Woodlawn was very proud," said father, "and he planned a brilliant future for his second son. Thomas, my father's name was. That's where he got your name, Tom. But Thomas Woodlawn wanted to live his own life, and he had fallen in love. His heart had overlooked all the fine young ladies of high degree, and had settled upon the little seamstress who embroidered and mended the stitches away all day in the sewing room of the great house." "Just like Tom and Cat," began Hetty, but Caddie suddenly thrust in butternut into her mouth, and the rest of what she had intended to say was lost. "I cannot blame him for falling in love," said father. "That little seamstress was very beautiful and sweet. She was my mother. They were married secretly, and then they went to old Woodlawn and told him. They thought that he would forgive them after it was all done and past, but they hadn't reckoned on the old man's stubbornness and wounded pride. You see, my mother was the daughter of the village shoemaker. God knows the old shoemaker earned an honest living and lived an upright life, but to my grandfather Woodlawn's notion anything connected with such a trade was low and shameful." "How funny," said Caddie. "If he was a good shoemaker." The old lord was beside himself with anger. He ordered father to forsake his bride, but that my father would not do so. So the old man turned them out together. "Never come back," he told my father. "You are no longer my son." If my father had been the eldest son, the laws of England would have restored his position to him at the death of the old lord. But a disinherited second son is nothing to look forward to, so now he found himself penniless and with a wife to support. "But I don't understand," said Caddie. "No, my dear," said her father. It was hard to understand an old man's selfish pride. He had planned his son's life. He could not endure to have his plans lightly set aside. It might have taken my father back if fathers had forsaken mother, but that was not my father's way. And so the two young things went out into the world to make a living for themselves. My father had been trained to ride a horse to hounds, to read a little Latin, and to grace a drawing room, but he knew no more about the useful trade than baby Joe. There was one thing he could do, however. He had always had some skill at drawing and painting, and as a boy his father had humored him by letting him have lessons in art. Now he was found that he could get occasional work by painting panels and murals in taverns and public houses. It was a sorry come down for the son of a nobleman. Sometimes they paid him only in food and lodging, and he and his wife were obliged to stay there eating and sleeping out his earnings. Truly they were gathered enough to have a roof over their heads and something in their stomachs, I imagine. I myself remember the long walks and the slim dinners, and sometimes nights spent under a haycock when we could find a tavern which wanted decorating. And that's 8:56.